my wife Sharon would put it, all government overreach, all socialism and all other forms of government overreach, it always starts out under the auspices of an emergency. And I think that's the awful truth to which the American people have awakened over the last 2 years. They've realized, oh my gosh, if they can call something an emergency, they can do anything they want. And when government can do anything it wants, and the people fear the government rather than the other way around, horrible things happen. So yeah, I think that has created a number of accidental conservatives and libertarians in this country, as they've seen that horrible abuses of government as it goes unquestioned, all under the auspices of, well, this is necessary because of an emergency.
So since you are a guy that cares about the actual rules and the way that we're supposed to be governed, I mean, in effect, it seems like we're at war right now. I mean, we haven't declared war. I know the president's supposed to declare war and it has to get authorized and everything else. But I mean, when you're pouring tons of money into something, when you're giving people weapons, et cetera, you in essence are at war. I mean, at what point do we start looking at that and having Congress or the Senate go, boy, are we at war? And how much money do you have to pour into something before you officially call it war? And if you keep giving a guy weapons, maybe it is war. Or again, is that just one of those things that it's just kind of, it is what it is, and the beat goes on?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely essential that before we take any more steps in the direction of warfare, that we take into account our role as a Congress in declaring war. Over many decades, Congress has gradually relinquished its declaration of war powers, as presidents of both political parties have asserted really broad powers attached to their inherent authority under Article 2 as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. This is problematic because it was one of the distinguishing characteristics of the Constitution. One of the things that made it very different than the English model, the system that we had just broken away from, allowed the chief executive, the king, to take us to war. And then it was up to Parliament to figure out how to pay for it. Under our system, Federalist 69 makes this very clear when Alexander Hamilton explains that it was with good reason we put the power to declare war in the first instance in the hands of Congress, because that's the branch most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. So I think if we're going to take any additional steps in this area, we really ought to have a conversation about whether, in what way, to what extent we want to be involved in a conflict with Russia. Keep in mind, Ukraine spends less than $5 billion a year in defense. Russia spends about $65 billion a year in defense. If you add up the previous Ukraine bill, $14 billion, to this Ukraine bill, $40 billion, you're talking about more than 10 times what Ukraine spends on defense in an entire year is what we have devoted in the name of Ukraine defense. And we're knocking on the door of what Russia spends on defense worldwide in an entire year.
Do you think we're in a bizarre situation as the last superpower, that we're still expected to do everything, but maybe we kind of just can't in a certain respect? I personally believe that. I believe in American exceptionalism. I believe the world is better when we're leading. I believe in peace through strength, all of those things. But that maybe right now, especially with the leadership that we have, that we just can't do that much good at the moment in these big international things.
Well, yeah, look, I think this is where we get dangerously off course. I think it is dangerous for any country, last standing superpower or not, to step into the mindset that says, if there is injustice in the world, we can be counted on as the presumptive police force. No nation can do that. No nation can withstand that. Certainly we can't. Our constitutional system should never allow that to happen. What really needs to happen is that anytime we get involved militarily, we really ought to have Congress declaring war before we take any action in that direction. And always the inquiry should be on not on whether bad people are doing bad things in another part of the world, but on how that affects American national security, the safety, security, the liberty of the American people at home. If we can't connect it to that, we shouldn't be doing it, because there is no end to the threats that we will face, the battles we will have to fight with no real corresponding ability to do all of those things. If our only task is to go out there and find bad people doing bad things, we'll be very busy, so busy indeed that we will leave the American people vulnerable in their own homeland.
So speaking of safety and liberty at home, 2 years or 2.5 years post-COVID, are you hopeful that more people have woken up to some of the states' rights stuff, some of the stuff related to the courts and mandates and all of the overreach that we saw? I mean, my sense is that a lot of people really have woken up. I don't know if they got scared again, if they would just drop all of their newfound ideas very quickly in the name of security, but I'm kind of hopeful at the moment.
Yeah, as my wife Sharon would put it, all government overreach, all socialism and all other forms of government overreach, always starts out under the auspices of an emergency. And I think that's the awful truth to which the American people have awakened over the last 2 years. They've realized, oh my gosh, if they can call something an emergency, they can do anything they want. And when government can do anything it wants, and the people fear the government rather than the other way around, horrible things happen. So yeah, I think that has created a number of accidental conservatives and libertarians in this country, as they've seen that horrible abuses of government as it goes unquestioned, all under the auspices of, well, this is necessary because of an emergency.
What do we do about organizations like the CDC and the FDA? I mean, they're not legislative bodies, but in essence, it seems like they legislate, and then it seems like, well, you just turn on any corporate news and they're all sponsored by Pfizer, sponsored by Moderna, as they're doing stories on Pfizer, on Moderna. What do we do about that mess?
Yeah, it's a great point. And by the way, I talk about this a fair amount in Saving Nine. That's why I like to say Saving Nine is not just about the Supreme Court. It's not just about court packing. It explains all of the maladies that flow inevitably from court packing and flowed from FDR's court packing threat back in the 1930s. As a result of that, we've got too much power that's been moved from the people to Washington. Then within Washington, too much power that has been voluntarily relinquished by the people's elected lawmakers and handed out to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, people at the CDC and the FDA, or the two that you mentioned. You notice of late it's been getting worse and worse, as the Centers for Disease Control is a whole lot more about the control than the disease. And the FDA, rather than just looking out for protecting the American people from unsafe products, is all about controlling them, controlling even the information to which they may gain access. This is the predictable, foreseeable, and I believe avoidable result of Congress outsourcing the task of legislation. We have for decades had a Congress that's in effect saying, we hereby declare that we shall have good law in area X, and we hereby delegate to commission or department Y the power to make good law in that area. And then they get to make the law and enforce it. That's a recipe for tyranny.
So going on the assumption that there will be a COVID-2 or another version of something this, or as your wife would say, something else that will scare us in the future, what actual authority does the CDC have? I think that was one of the things that really confused people, that every day someone from the CDC, Walensky or one of these people would get up there, they would say something, and then people automatically felt, oh, that's what they said, we have to do it. But that's not exactly how this thing works, right?
It's not exactly how it works, but there's enough legislation on the books that gives these government agencies, including the CDC, at least a colorable claim to the authority to dictate how much of our economy runs, that they can get by the initial smell test. And see, not everything gets litigated. This is another point I make in Saving Nine. Not every dispute, not every question about constitutionality goes to the Supreme Court. Most cases don't even get litigated. A very small percentage of those that get litigated make their way all the way to the Supreme Court. And it can take months or sometimes years to get to the bottom of some of these problems. In the meantime, a lot of these disputes have become moot, and the courts then start to lack jurisdiction over them. That's why we need genuine, deep reform where we withdraw the authority, the delegated authority to make new law. It's one of the reasons why I believe so strongly in the need to pass things like the REINS Act. Look, if I were in charge of Congress and I had just one legislative measure that I could pick and guarantee passage of, it would be the REINS Act. Their acronym is REINS, stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. To make a long story short, it says that we're not going to allow unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats to make our laws anymore. That will be done only by Congress. And when an executive branch agency uses delegate authority to create what is in effect a new law, that will not be self-executing after the passage of the REINS Act. It will require an affirmative vote by Congress to pass it into law. You see, people can fire their elected lawmakers periodically. You can't fire a government bureaucrat. That's why we need the REINS Act.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist, all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.